The year was 1919, when French-American hotel owner, 49-year-old Raymond Ortega, would attend a dinner in New York City that had been set up by the Aero Club of America to pay tribute to America's top ace of the recently ended World War I, a man named Eddie Rickenbacker. After a long night of speeches glorifying the French-American friendship, Rickenbacker would go to the front of the room and simply state he was looking forward to the day that France and America will be linked by air. Because you have to remember at this point, a continuous transatlantic flight from mainland North America to mainland Europe had never been completed. But it was with that little bit of inspiration that Raymond Ortega got an idea. He would offer the Ortega Prize, which was $25,000, or about $460,000 in today's money, to the first aviator, or aviators, that could make a non-stop transatlantic flight between New York and Paris. There were only two catches. First, it would have to take place within the next 5 years, and the pilots had to be from an allied nation. The reward obviously was quite handsome, but the danger was overwhelming, and suffice to say, no one collected the money. But after 5 years, Raymond must have felt generous, because he renewed his offer, and by now, flight technology was getting advanced, and the first transatlantic trip would be completed soon. It was just going to be a race to see who. And many adventurous men would answer the call, and they started plotting their trip, with the majority of them planning to fly out from New York and then going to Paris. But there were a few French aviators that took up the challenge and planned to fly from Paris to New York. This is where our mystery begins, because two French men would come forward and accept the challenge. 35-year-old Charles Nungesser, who was the third best fighter pilot for France in World War I, taking down 43 German aircrafts. Along with him would come his partner, 45-year-old Francois Collat. Now Francois, in spite of not being a top fighter pilot, was a pretty respected man in his own right. He was an established captain of a merchant ship, joined the army in World War I, where he was quickly promoted to captain, only to suffer multiple wounds and be declared unfit for the infantry. So he became a fighter pilot and would lead his own squadron. This doesn't even take into account that he would set several records for long-distance flights after the war. The two would come together in an effort to fly their specially crafted Levasseur PL-8 that they would name Oiseau Blanc, or translated, White Bird, which they hoped to fly across the Atlantic and then share the prize at the end. But instead, they would share one of the greatest aviation mysteries ever. The two men would depart at 5:17 a.m. on May 8, 1927, where they intended to fly over the English Channel, southwest England, Ireland, across the Atlantic to Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Boston, and then finally, New York City. The country and whole world watched in anticipation, and the plane was soon spotted in Britain, followed by Ireland, and as news spread, crowds of people began to gather in New York to watch history be made. In fact, the number of people was said to be in the tens of thousands who anxiously awaited. Before long, rumors swept through this mass of people that the White Bird had been spotted. Some people said in Newfoundland, others said Long Island. It didn't really matter, because what it really meant was the aircraft would soon touch down in New York. Meanwhile in France, newspapers even began to report that the two men had arrived safely, and patriotism swept the countryside, a thing France sorely needed during the rebuild from the very decimating World War. But as the crowds in France rejoiced, the crowds in America were confused. Although rumors circulated that the men were close by and would be landing at any time, there was no aircraft, which made it even stranger that France was in full-on celebration. Had these onlookers somehow missed the landing? Not likely, and they soon realized that as well, and the aircraft never arrived, and could possibly be lost. Of course, this news too slowly spread back to France, and people were obviously extremely upset, and the newspapers that had falsely reported the story would take a beating from the public. Some of the citizens even went to the press offices and held demonstrations in front of their buildings. But this was no time for anger, because a search had to be organized, and quickly. It would actually be conducted by a man named Floyd Bennett, who would go on to make the first flight over the North Pole with Richard E. Byrd. He searched over the route for a total of 9 days, not finding one clue from the flight. Meanwhile, the Canadian government began sending out search parties as well, along with the French Navy and US Navy. They searched the ocean, St. Lawrence River, the northeast coast of the US, and just a very wide area overall, and there were no signs of the craft. And you might be thinking, well, it probably went down in the ocean, but that's what makes this one odd. The aircraft had huge modifications completed, which would allow for a safe landing on the water, even in an emergency situation. In fact, the men intended to have a water landing when they got to New York, and because of that, there had been floats attached to the lower wings, and the craft's weight had been reduced, along with the fuselage, which had been given a boat-like shape. It would be difficult for this craft to completely sink and not leave any debris behind. Regardless, the investigators came to the conclusion that the White Bird would have had to have ran into a sudden severe storm which forced it into the sea, and searchers simply had not located it yet. But there was a problem with this theory, because soon witnesses came forward. At least 16 different people in Newfoundland and Maine claimed they had heard the aircraft flying overhead. And you may be thinking, well, how could they possibly know it was the White Bird? Again, that goes back to the era that this took place in. There just wasn't many planes flying around. And once investigators looked into the witness claims, they found that no aircraft had been scheduled to be up in the air that day, meaning that this mysterious unknown aircraft was quite possibly the White Bird. This would even be followed up on by residents living in Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, who stated they seen a white aircraft circling in the fog on May 9th. This was backed up by a hermit living isolated at a camp near the lake. He told searchers that on the afternoon of May 9th, he heard a sputtering aircraft fly over and make a crash landing in the distance. He could never see it fly over due to the immense fog or clouds. He did try to find where it had went down though, but he never discovered it. Strangely enough, another investigation was carried out over 50 years later, and that came up with numerous witnesses in both Nova Scotia and eastern Maine who claimed to have seen the craft fly over. Of course, with this being over a half a century later when they were interviewed, it's possible this was just false memories. Still, there was no tangible proof of what had happened to the aircraft. Although the US Coast Guard would find an airplane wing off the coast of Long Island a few days later, they could not conclusively connect it to the White Bird. Likewise, wreckage found 3 months later about 200 miles off the coast of New York was speculated to have been from the aircraft, but again, no one could connect it for sure. So what happened to the men? And is it possible they did reach the continent and crash landed somewhere, beating Charles Lindbergh by 2 weeks? As far as the what happened, because of the lack of evidence, many rumors were abound. There were some claims that the plane had been shot down by bootleggers on a boat carrying rum, at the orders of none other than Al Capone, who did frequent the area. Conversely, there was a rumor that the US Coast Guard accidentally shot it down thinking it was smugglers, or that the 2 men had made a safe crash landing and after not being rescued, they lived with the indigenous peoples of Canada, still waiting to be found. There were even claims that the aircraft's engine had been found in Maine, but when this story was looked into, there was no corroborating evidence. And that would be the way it would go for the following years, with stories emerging for at least 20 years that hunters, or trappers, had stumbled across the aircraft wreckage in Newfoundland. Again, there was never any real hard data that backed up any of these claims. There's also been stories that the aircraft's propeller was found underwater in Maine, or that the compass was recovered and sold at a flea market and was never found again. The French government, for their part, did their own investigation, where they felt confident in saying they did make it to Newfoundland, but after that, they were not sure. Others were still convinced that the 2 had made it to Maine or they crashed somewhere in the forest. And again, there's some data that kinda backs it, just nothing conclusive. Like bits and pieces of struts of wood that would have been used in a biplane, or engine metal recovered near the town of Machias along the flight path that was not typically used in the US or Canada. And there were also reports of a really big motor that had been dragged out of the woods and sent to salvage. Regardless, without conclusive proof that the men made it, Lindbergh would take home the prize and would be remembered as an American hero. El Dorado is a name I'm sure most of you have heard at some point. Its translation, the Golden One, is supposed to be a reference to a long-lost city of, you guessed it, gold, or perhaps a chief of gold. It's become ingrained into our culture, tying all forms of media, like music. Both Neil Young and Shakira have El Dorado albums, or even in the genre of video games, like Uncharted, Drake's Fortune, where he looks for the lost treasure, or one of Paradox's 100 bad DLCs for Europa Universalis 4 called El Dorado. But I digress. What is the whole story behind El Dorado? How did it even get started? And most importantly, how much of it, if any, is true? The story really truly begins upon the first contact between Columbus and the natives, where he would spot a few golden ornaments worn by inhabitants of the various Caribbean islands. This was the catalyst that sent the Spaniards in search of more. In fact, there were many just after this first encounter that started to believe that there just had to be a huge source for this gold, since so many of the natives were wearing these little golden trinkets. The reasons for this vary, but some of it has to do with a number of European legends that spoke to cities of gold, and some of it comes down to the Spanish just hoping there was. However, the first settlers that came after Columbus were soon to be disappointed when they found no huge vein of precious metal. But we're just getting started. The first references that Europeans would get about a city of gold in South America would actually come about due to a German conquistador, not a Spanish one, when in August 1529, a man named Ambrosius Dalfinger was made governor of the settlement of Coro in Venezuela, and given the task of finding a passage to the continent to the Pacific Ocean. It was here he began his campaign of wandering around the landmass, which they had greatly underestimated the size of, and he would come across numerous golden trinkets they stole from the locals. Upon asking them where they got it, they always claimed that they had traded for it with a tribe that lived high in the mountains. This was the beginning of the lost city of gold, although it did not have a name yet. That word would come soon though, because 2 years later, another German explorer, Nicholas Federmann, while still looking for a passage to the Pacific Ocean, began to hear stories of a mountain province called Zeria, which was supposed to be the source of all the gold for the South American natives. Now this location, we don't actually know where it was, but it was most likely a reference to a mountain province called Heria, which was thought to be located on the Muisca Plateau in the northernmost part of modern-day Colombia. In either case, Federmann headed towards Colombia and had to turn back because of the danger, and ironically, died on his way back due to a poisoned arrow. Now, coincidentally, right around this same time, conquistador Diego de Ordaz was looking for the source of the Orinoco River, and eventually found where it met up with the Meta River. It was here they would be attacked by natives, and after a swift victory, he would take some prisoners and ask about gold, like all Spaniards. This would be where the second part of the legend would come in, because these two native prisoners told Diego de Ordaz that if they followed the Meta River, they would find a kingdom ruled by a one-eyed Indian that would fill their boats with gold. Ordaz tried to find this location, and he failed, and like Federmann, he would die on his way back. Now fast forward 5 years to 1534, and we have another conquistador, Sebastian de Belalcazar, who would conquer the Incan city of Quito. And after not finding treasure he assumed they had, he began capturing and torturing local chiefs. One of these said he came from a land that was a 12 days ride north. This chief, whose real name is lost, would be nicknamed by the Spaniards the Golden Indian. And just like his name, we have no idea why his nickname was applied. Maybe it was a suit of golden armor, or just an array of golden ornaments. Whatever the reason, they were now interested in this Golden Indian, and the expedition headed north to find this land of the Golden Indian, one step closer to the legend of El Dorado. Meanwhile, during all of this, Colombia was in the midst of being explored and conquered, all because Nicholas Federmann had heard the source of the gold in South America was in this region of the Muisca Plateau. Now, to keep from sounding like a broken record, I'm not going to cover every instance of this in detail, because quite simply, there's too many accounts. It seems like wherever a Spanish explorer went, natives would tell them about this place that had huge amounts of gold. For example, German conquistador Georg Ormuth von Speyer was told that this land was in the far western part of South America, while Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada was roaming the countryside looking for the land of Meta. This went on and on for the next few years, and finally in 1539, the first reference to the land called El Dorado was finally documented. After this, it would be another 2 years when Spanish historian Oviedo would document the story he had heard from Spanish inhabitants relating to El Dorado, the Golden Chief. According to the story in this new form, the Indian chief went around his daily life covered in gold dust, and he washed it away each night, then used a gum or resin the next morning to hold the new gold dust on him when he powdered his body from head to toe. Now, where this variation of the story came from is unsure, but it most likely came from an expedition that had just returned, and the stories continued to roll in. One Indian trader that visited the city of Quito told a similar story of the Golden Chief. In fact, he claimed that the gold made him so bright that he looked like rays of the sun. The Spaniards, upon hearing this, gave the chief the name El Dorado, and as they say, the rest is history. But it leaves us with the main question of this mystery. Did this chief, or city, actually exist? Or was there something else for the source of this legend? Interestingly, a lot of historians now believe that this all came from the vivid imaginations of the very greedy Spanish. But there is surprisingly some evidence of the existence of El Dorado, or at least the chief. The Muisca Raft, or sometimes called the Golden Raft of El Dorado, is a pre-Columbian golden piece created by the Muisca people of Colombia, and it possibly depicts a ceremony in which a new chief would set aboard a raft covered in gold dust, where he would toss golden objects into the lake as an offering to the gods, before he himself stepped into the lake, which sounds a lot like El Dorado. But it's worth pointing out, some historians disagree that this piece is actually depicting that, and instead, it might just be showing an ordinary leisure cruise. But I'll let you make that call. Finally, by 1800, nearly 3 centuries after the events, scholar Alexander von Humboldt was hired by Spain to search for El Dorado. After 5 years, he came to the conclusion the whole thing was a myth, partially driven by the Spanish's desire for wealth, and the natives fabricating the stories in an attempt to get the Spanish to leave. But the stories about El Dorado the Chief could be real, or at least inspired by several different chiefs that carried out this ceremony that the Spanish never personally witnessed. Today, the story is more popularly used as a cautionary tale against unchecked ambition, greed, and misunderstanding. In the winter of 1804 and 1805, a 55-year-old man named John Bell would take his family over the dangerous mountains that ran along the border of North Carolina and East Tennessee. The country was still young, and there was ample opportunity for many a young man to make a name for themselves. They would make it through the countryside and finally settle in an area we now know today as Adams, Tennessee, in the northwestern part of the state. The couple were joined by their 9 children, and luckily for John, the family prospered. They may have been the most successful planters in the area, and it stayed that way for close to a decade. But that is not why we're discussing this story. We're actually taking a look because, well, this would be one of the most bizarre stories told in American history. Because it was 1817, 12 years after the family had moved to the area, that John had been out on the farm inspecting his corn, and he suddenly spotted something strange. It was some kind of animal he had never seen before, one that gave him a weird feeling. It just sat there in the middle of the corn row, staring at him. It had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. Being frightened, he would pull out his gun, took aim, and fired. Nothing happened. So he would fire several more times, and the calm animal simply stared and vanished. John was a bit perturbed, like any of us would be, but life goes on, and being an early 19th century farmer in the unsettled regions of West Tennessee, well, he couldn't simply sit around all day wondering what it was he had seen. So he went on about his business. But it was later that evening when things got stranger, because it was just after dinner that the whole family began to hear beating sounds on the outside walls of their log home. John and his sons rushed outside to see what was going on, but nothing was out there, so he thought maybe this was just a one-off, but that would not be the case, because the beating continued and actually increased with frequency and force, and it happened every night. After this point, things got worse. Soon, John's children would begin waking up in the middle of the night to see rats gnawing on their bedpost. This, among all the other strange happenings, terrified them. It only got worse when their children would wake up to see their covers had been pulled off and their pillows had been tossed to the floor, seemingly by some invisible entity. Little did the Bells know this was just the beginning. As the time went on, they began to hear a faint, whispering voice, which was too weak to understand, but sounded like an old woman singing religious songs. But this spirit, or whatever it was, must have been getting bored, because it soon escalated. Betsy, the youngest daughter, began to get physically assaulted by the thing. He would pull her hair and slap her, leaving her parents to find bruises and handprints all over her face and body. This carried on for a while, and John finally broke down and told someone, because up to this point, it had been a family secret, as they didn't want anyone to think they were crazy. But he soon confided in his best friend, a man named James Johnston. And Johnston, yeah, he did think they were crazy, and he really doubted their story. But John was persistent and asked James and his wife to spend the night. So they did. Now at first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as the night carried on, that would change, and they would begin to witness these same oddities that John had told them about. It finally culminated when the blankets were ripped off the Johnstons and James was slapped across the face. This caused him to jump out of the bed and scream, "In the name of the Lord, who are you and what do you want?" This must have shaken the spirit up some, because it remained quiet for the rest of the night. The next morning, the two families would meet and discuss the night over breakfast, and it's then that James began to speculate that it was some kind of evil spirit like the Bible discussed, maybe a witch. Soon, this witch would get the name Kate, and she began to pick it up. Soon, the singing got louder, and then Bible verses began to get quoted throughout the home, and it carried on conversations with itself. The Bell family would even go on to say that it quoted two separate sermons that had been preached in town 13 miles apart. The big catch to this was, it was quoting both sermons at the same time. By this point, the whole thing was becoming a spectacle, and the growing town of Nashville even started to hear the stories. There was even an account that famed general and future president Andrew Jackson would go visit the haunted home, although this part of the story has been heavily disputed ever since. Regardless, the next part is where history was truly made. The disturbances did seem to die down some, and really, the entity only targeted one person, John Bell himself, where the witch often threatened to kill him. And for the following year, John would begin to experience twitching in his face and had difficulty swallowing, and it only got worse over time. By the fall of 1820, he was confined to his home, where he was slapped repeatedly, suffered numerous seizures, and would even have his shoes ripped off if he tried to walk. He would hear the witches scream all over the farm, cursing him. And on December 20th, he slipped into a coma and died. His family, beset by grief, would come across something truly strange. In looking through a cupboard right after his death, they found a vial of strange black liquid. John Jr., smart enough not to touch the liquid, put a couple of drops onto the tongue of their pet cat, and it immediately died. They now wondered, had their father been poisoned? I mean, obviously, he had been bedbound for quite a while anyways, but had Kate the witch followed through her promise and given him poison? Crazily enough, the spirit wasn't done, and apparently was even heard singing during John's burial. Now I know this story sounds completely insane, and probably fictitious, but according to the records we have, this is a true account, but there might be a very plausible explanation. See, Betsy Bell, John's daughter, like any young lady, would soon find herself interested in young men, and one of these was a neighbor named Joshua Gardner. Not only did he live nearby, but he went to school with Betsy, and he had a crush on her too. They would eventually get engaged, and everyone was happy, except for you-know-who, the Bell Witch, who soon made her return and told Betsy to never marry Josh, and the witch would even follow the two around, trying to scare them out of getting married. Now you're probably wondering, what is the plausible explanation that I mentioned? Enter a weirdo named Richard Powell. See, old Richard was actually the school teacher of Betsy and Joshua, and apparently he had taken quite an interest in the much too young schoolchild, Betsy, when she was in his class. The ages are not specifically stated, but we do know Professor Richard Powell was 11 years older than her, and we also know she was engaged to Joshua when she was 15 years old, so I'm going to guess when she was in Powell's class, she was around the age of 13 or 14, and he was around 25. Regardless of the number, the whole thing was weird, because Powell, when he was her teacher, began expressing a desire to marry her when she got a little bit older. Making this even stranger was the fact he was already secretly married to a woman in Nashville, which wasn't that far away. But to everyone in the community of Adams, they thought he was a bachelor. Interestingly, during this time, he did go to Betsy and voice his displeasure that she was going to marry Joshua, but he wished her the best anyways. Now all of this is circumstantial and may not be anything until this next part, because Professor Powell was quite an educated man. Not only was he a math genius and brilliant in horticulture and geology, he also had a pretty good knowledge of the occult, and most importantly, he was a master of ventriloquism. Could he have been the strange voice all along? Well, we don't know for sure, but he seems like a good suspect. Crazily enough, Betsy couldn't handle the stress of this so-called deity following her and Joshua around, since they could never get privacy, and she broke off the engagement. And not long after that, the so-called witch seemed happy and said she was leaving, but would return 7 years later, and did, allegedly, only to talk to John Bell Jr., where she supposedly made a bunch of predictions for future major events, like the Civil War. But the story also has an even more bizarre ending, because 3 years after Betsy broke off her engagement to Joshua, she married Professor Powell. And if you recall, the so-called witch only made one more appearance after 1821, and it spoke to her brother. Now this is basically the core of the story, but there are other variations where other little details are added or removed, like the appearance of an extraordinary sized bird that apparently sat on the fence watching members of the Bell family, or Betsy seeing the girl/spirit in a green dress swinging from a limb on a tree. There was also the account of one of the slaves that told the Bells they had been followed by a large black dog in the evenings prior that seemingly vanished. There's even one bizarre claim that a family friend caught the witch and tried to throw her into the flames, but she was too heavy and the stench overwhelmed him, making him sick. Today, most historians and researchers that look into the case believe something did happen, but what exactly that was is hard to say. Professor Powell is certainly a good suspect though, although it is quite strange that he targeted John Bell for so long to allegedly have had such an obsession with his daughter Betty. By 1849 though, newspapers covering the now nearly 3-decade-old story began to speculate that the real culprit was none other than Betsy herself. The paper specifically claimed that Betsy had mastered ventriloquism too, and it just made a lot more sense for her to be behind the whole thing, because Professor Powell could have never hid in their home for such a long period of time. She did threaten the newspaper after the article, and they had to remove it. After this, she would never discuss the events with anyone outside the family, and she spent the rest of her life terrified of sleeping alone. And that might be because there was really a witch that tormented the family. Early July 1947, rancher W. Brazel was working along his property when he would make a discovery that put this little-known town in New Mexico on the map. Here he found some wreckage that he couldn't really explain. Not knowing what else to do, he collected some of it and took it to the sheriff, a George Wilcox, who was living in Roswell. This would be the beginning of the Roswell Incident. Before long, Sheriff Wilcox, also not knowing what else to do, contacted a Colonel William Blanchard, who was commanding the Roswell Army Airfield, and asked him to come take a look. Now, it's super important to note here that leading up to this event, several stories had appeared in papers across the country which documented the so-called flying saucers. So it's easy to see where these men, who had found all this weird debris, might leap to the conclusion that this was the crash of a UFO. And actually, as the story spread about the crash, that's exactly what the newspapers would begin to print. Within 24 hours, the Roswell Army Airfield would even release a statement confirming the rumors that they did in fact recover a flying saucer, and they were investigating it now. However, within a day of that, they took back that story. This would not be the last time the Army would do that. Now they claimed it was actually debris from a weather balloon and released photos of a Major Marcel posing with the debris as proof. And to be fair, there had been several balloon trains lost in New Mexico that summer. But the pressure was already on as the public smelled a cover-up. But it would be nearly 50 years before they would do a 180 and admit the weather balloon story was totally made up, and that the rancher had really discovered an early spy device from a secret program called Project Mogul. It was basically high-altitude balloons equipped with microphones that would fly over the Soviet Union and monitor for atomic bomb testing. This technology in 1994, of course, was now so old that it didn't matter. So they just cleared the air, explained that the UFO story was just a cover to hide it from the Soviets. If that was all there was, then maybe you could write the whole thing off. But there was more. Like some of the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen alien bodies taken from the crash. These humanoids had large heads like light bulbs and large eyes, with 4 elongated fingers, yellowish or tan skin. Could the government actually explain that? Well, it seems they could. As they stated, this was nothing more than fallen parachute test dummies which had been used. However, there were serious doubts to this claim and the UFO claims, and people point to a much more plausible theory. What if it was neither a UFO nor a top-secret American project? What if the US was just too embarrassed to admit a Soviet spycraft had gotten over the border? Maybe even with a couple of Soviet pilots who crashed to the desert floor. Maybe this is the real reason why the UFO cover story was invented. Actually, this theory would take on a much darker turn, because according to national security journalist and author Annie Jacobson, she made contact with an engineer at Area 51 who told her that the evil Nazi concentration camp doctor, Joseph Mengele, had designed a program to make adolescent children look deformed, or like aliens. And the Soviets, working along with him after the war, pushed the experiments further. And according to this source, the plan was to fly this craft over New Mexico, where it would crash with these children that looked like aliens that would inevitably be found inside, and then create pandemonium in the public over the thought that the country was being visited by people from Mars, which would then ultimately cause America's radar system to be overwhelmed with so-called UFOs. That is all a crazy theory, but it could explain everything. Although, it has to be pointed out, the Soviet archives have no record of this. And we have to go with the final theory that maybe it was a UFO crash. February 19th, 1994, around 8:15 p.m., a woman named Gloria Ramirez would be brought into the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital by paramedics. She was suffering from severe heart palpitations and an abnormal pattern of breathing. The medical staff would try and sedate her, but Gloria was responding poorly to treatment, so the staff tried to defibrillate her heart. Once they did, several people saw a weird, oily appearance covering her body, and they noticed a fruity garlic-like odor that they at first thought was coming from her mouth. The registered nurse, Susan Kane, would draw blood from her arm and noticed an ammonia-like smell in the tube. There was also manila-colored crystals floating in her blood. At this point, Kane fainted and was removed from the room. The medical resident, Julie Gorginski, would begin to feel nauseated and lightheaded and had to leave the trauma room. She would also end up fainting. Maureen Welch, a respiratory therapist who was assisting in the trauma room, would be the third to faint before the staff then ordered everyone to evacuate all emergency department patients outside to the parking lot. A skeleton crew stayed behind, trying to stabilize Ramirez. However, she was pronounced dead about 45 minutes later from complications related to cervical cancer. Overall, 23 of the 37 staff became ill and 5 were hospitalized. The most seriously ill, June Gorginski, was in intensive care for 2 weeks, contracting apnea, hepatitis, pancreatitis, and necrosis of the bone marrow, which crippled her legs for months and required 3 surgeries. A hazmat team would search the hospital for every toxic substance you can think of, but nothing was found. He would be left up to the coroner, who would end up doing the autopsy in a hazmat suit, and he found nothing. The woman dubbed the Toxic Lady was not toxic at all. So just what happened in that emergency room? Doctors stated that Gloria died from complications of cervical cancer, as she had been in the late stages prior to this event. But why was her body toxic to the medical team? There are 2 main theories surrounding this. Initially, the incident was written off as a mass hysteria event, but this has been for the most part discredited. Soon, another theory was brought about that gained a lot of traction. It was speculated that Gloria had been using DMSO, a chemical solvent that is used to reduce inflammation and pain. It was thought she had used so much that when the medical team used a defibrillator, it converted the solvent to dimethyl sulfate, which is extremely poisonous. That would also explain the garlic smell that the team spoke of. However, some scientists have said that would be impossible. And that brings us to the conclusion of this installment of the Historical Mysteries and Oddities. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.